Hello, people. Welcome back to Edbet Leadership. Recently, over 30 African leaders gathered in Nairobi, Kenya, alongside the French President Emmanuel Macron for the Africa Forward Summit, a major international gathering focused on innovation, trade, investment, AI, energy, industrialization, and Africa's place in the future global economy. It is evident that Africa does not primarily have a resource problem. Africa has, in my view, a leadership adaptation problem, because the continent is full of young people, ideas, minerals, markets, energy, creativity, entrepreneurial spirit. And yet many African nations still struggle to convert potential into sustainable progress. But beyond the speeches and the diplomatic photo ops, the summit exposed something deeper. It exposed the urgent leadership work African nations must now do if the continent is going to move forward. Because let me say this importantly, very importantly, no summit can rescue a continent that refuses to do the adaptive work of leadership. No foreign investment can substitute for internal leadership capacity. No partnership can replace institutional maturity. And no amount of external money can solve internal leadership dysfunction. So in this episode, I want us to examine together not simply what happened at the summit, but leadership lessons that African nations must urgently embrace. And I want to frame this through the adaptive leadership lens. Because Africa's greatest challenges are not merely technical, like I would say often. They are adaptive. They require mindset shifts, institutional transformation, cultural change, and leadership maturity. In this episode, I want to share 7 leadership action steps African countries should take, if Africa is truly going to move forward. The Africa Forward Summit, jointly hosted by Kenya and France, was historic for several reasons. Firstly, it was the first major Africa-France summit hosted in an English-speaking African country. That matters because it signaled a shift in geopolitical thinking. Secondly, the summit focused heavily on innovation, AI, green energy, industrialization, finance reform, trade partnerships, youth, and investment. Thirdly, more than 23 billion euros in investment commitments were announced between African and French companies. But beneath all that, there was another conversation happening, a deeper one. African leaders were essentially saying, we don't simply want aid anymore. We want fair access to opportunity. And that's a powerful shift. And honestly, in my opinion, that shift reflects a readiness for what I call leadership maturity, because dependency is not development. And Africa cannot continue to negotiate with the world from a posture of permanent vulnerability. One of the most important statements from the summit came from the host country's president, President William Ruto. He said, the issue is not liquidity, it is risk architecture. And that's simply profound, because African nations often complain, we need more money. But the deeper issue is, can investors trust your systems? Can citizens trust your institutions? Can businesses trust your policies? Can the world trust your governance structures? And leadership is not simply about attracting capital. Leadership is about creating environments where trust can survive. And this is where, in my view, many African nations, still struggle. Not because Africans are incapable, but because institutions remain weak, systems remain personalized, and governance is often unstable. You cannot build sustainable prosperity on an unstable leadership culture. So let's look at 7 leadership actions that African nations should take. Number 1, move from personality-based leadership to institution-based leadership. Many African countries are still excessively dependent on personalities. One strong president, one powerful regional governor, one dominant political figure. But nations do not become stable through personalities. They become stable through institutions. Strong institutions outlive strong men. And this is adaptive work, because many political systems in Africa still reward loyalty over competence. Until systems become stronger than individuals, Africa will continue recycling instability. What's the leadership action to take note of? Build systems that survive transitions. Point number 2, stop confusing political power with leadership. And this is one of Africa's greatest leadership failures. Authority is not leadership. Holding office does not automatically mean you are leading. Leadership is the activity of mobilizing people to face reality and make progress. And many African governments are still heavily invested in control, image management, political dominance, and suppression of criticism. But adaptive leadership requires something harder, bringing reality to the surface. And this is why opposition voices matter. Civil society matters. Independent media matters. Constructive criticism matters. A system that cannot tolerate feedback eventually collapses under hidden dysfunction. Point number 3, invest aggressively in human capital. The summit focused heavily on AI, technology, and innovation, and rightly so, because Africa's greatest resource is not oil, it's not gold, it's not lithium, it's the people. Africa has the youngest population in the world, but youthfulness alone is not an advantage. An untrained youthful population can become instability instead of innovation. This means African leadership must stop treating education as expenditure. Education is national infrastructure. Skills development is national security. And what's the leadership action here? Massively invest in education, digital skills, critical thinking, research, entrepreneurship, and vocational capability. Because the future economy belongs to nations that develop people. My point number 4, build economies, not political slogans. Africa has mastered political rhetoric, but rhetoric does not create jobs. Slogans do not industrialize nations. Emotion does not build infrastructure. One thing the summit made clear is that global competition is intensifying. Nations are fighting for investment, technology, manufacturing, energy influence, supply chains, and innovation ecosystems. Africa cannot keep consuming what it does not produce. This is why industrialization matters, and this is why value addition matters. This is why intra-African trade matters. And the leadership action to embrace is move beyond campaign politics into long-term economic thinking. And point number 5, reform governance culture. This is uncomfortable but necessary. Corruption is not merely a legal problem, it is a leadership culture problem. Because corruption survives where accountability is weak, systems are opaque, and loyalty matters more than integrity. You cannot build investor confidence in environments where governance lacks predictability. And citizens themselves become exhausted when systems feel unfair. Adaptive leadership requires confronting cultural dysfunction honestly, not defensively. And the leadership action to embrace is build transparent systems, digitize public services, reduce bureaucratic opacity, and reward competence over patronage. My point number 6, learn strategic partnerships without dependency. One thing I appreciated about the summit was the attempt to frame the Africa-France relations around partnership rather than dependency. Now that matters. Africa must learn strategic engagement, not emotional isolation, not blind dependence, strategic engagement. The world is changing rapidly. China, Europe, America, India, Russia, the Gulf states, everyone is competing for influence in Africa. So African nations must therefore negotiate intelligently, not from desperation, not from inferiority, but from clarity of interest. And the leadership action to embrace is develop leaders who understand geopolitics, economics, technology, and long-term national strategy. Point number 7, develop leadership beyond government. This is critical. Governments alone cannot transform Africa. Leadership must emerge from business, families, faith organizations, universities, communities, media, in our civic spaces. Because leadership is not a position. Leadership is a practice. And until African societies democratize leadership development, many nations will remain trapped waiting for political saviors. Africa does not need more heroes. Africa needs more leadership capacity distributed across society. And this is how healthy nations emerge. Let me say something clearly to African leaders and African citizens alike. No country is coming to develop Africa for Africa. Every nation pursues its interest. That's the reality. France has interest. China has interest. America has interest. And Africa must also learn to pursue African interest intelligently. And this is where leadership maturity matters, because emotionally reacting to global powers is not strategy. Building internal capability is strategy. And honestly, this is the work before Africa now. And these are my concluding thoughts. The Africa Forward Summit was important, but Africa's future will not ultimately be decided at conferences. It will be decided in institutions, in communities, in a leadership culture that we build, in governance behavior, and in how African leaders respond to the reality that we face. Because leadership is not in speeches. Leadership is not ceremonies. Leadership is not title. Leadership is the courage to confront difficult truths and mobilize people towards meaningful progress. Africa is standing at a historic crossroad. The continent is young. The continent is energetic. The continent is strategic. The continent is globally significant. But potential means nothing without leadership capacity. And this is why I keep saying Africa does not merely need new politicians or politicians rising. Africa needs a new leadership culture, a culture that values competence over loyalty, institutions over personality, service over power, responsibility over rhetoric, and progress over performance. Because the future will not belong to the loudest nations. It will belong to the nations that learn, adapt, build, and lead. And perhaps the biggest leadership question Africa must now answer is this: can Africa stop waiting to be developed and finally begin leading its own development? Thank you for listening to Edbert Leadership. If this episode challenged your thinking, share it, subscribe, and continue the conversation, because leadership is not a position. Leadership is a responsibility. And Africa's future depends on how many people are willing to practice leadership. See you soon. Thank you.